now you have to endure me with mad ramblings. Like the advantage of being, like of organizing something like this, you see a lot of the presentations, you have an idea of what's going to happen. So I had an opportunity to, like get advanced warning about some of the topics. On the other hand, I also been to a couple of conferences very recently with a lot of reflections happening there about some of the methods that we've been discussing explicitly or implicitly today. And so what I will do is I will essentially try and give some reflections on these methods, like tongue-in-cheek, I called it challenging the challenging methods. Because it's a workshop where we're supposed to provide some kind of thoughts or ideas about the methods itself. I will try and focus on them. So there will be a lot of statistics there, but I will not show you any numbers. So I spare you that. But I try and provide some kind of what is actually behind some of the numbers. So I'll come back to like that study that is being cited a lot, that you can prove anything with factor analysis. I hope to reflect a little bit on that. So why do I reflect on this? Because we've been working on this stuff with the project for 2 years now. Unfortunately, we don't have time to talk a lot about the things that we have found already. Everton presented a few snippets of the stuff that we have been doing. So we have conducted and pretty much finished 2 major reviews. One is actually published. The other one, I really hope we can get a discussion going tomorrow or on Saturday to advance with that. Just to give you a bit of an idea of the data that we have collected, and I hope we will have another event like this where we can actually show what the results are. We have over 3,000 open-ended responses during the validation process. So what Elliot described, using that method, we have a lot of data that we have processed, but there's still a lot of stuff that can be looked at. Everton talked about the 22 responses with spirit mediums and spiritual leaders. We now have about over 4,000 descriptions of non-ordinary experiences. It's a lot of data, so there's a lot of scope. If you're interested in getting involved, doing analyses of this. In total, we have now over 10,000. We actually discovered another data set which was not included in the counting here. We have 10,500 something responses, survey responses on non-ordinary experiences, and most of these samples are actually representative according to census data from 2010. We don't have a lot of good information on lower educated participants, but we have a lot of information. And so we have a lot of data. We have partially analyzed some of that data, a lot of really interesting insights coming from there, and you won't hear anything about it from me today. Also, one thing that is really important, talking about methods, and my talk is kind of the method C talk. You heard a method theory, philosophy talk. Now you have a method boring, get your pillow, sleep a bit before we get to the happy hour. So if you're interested about what we're doing statistically, we're basically using a lot of emerging tools to throw them at the data. We have so much data that using traditional methods, it's challenging to get a good picture. And in order to safeguard us, we do a lot of pre-registration. So we basically try and say, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and then see what the results are. We are learning also, we have 7 pre-registrations online, so you can look at it, what we're planning to do. A lot of the data is online as well, so you can get it, you can analyze it, and work with it. So key points that I want to basically, hopefully, emphasize today. First of all, human experiences are highly variable, which creates problems for us if we want to actually generalize about Brazilians or about members of a specific religious group. I'm not going, there's a really interesting philosophical, statistical discussion going on whether we can actually use general methods like the ones that I will talk about in a second to describe subjective experiences. There's a whole discussion going on in the literature. I'm not going to go into that. The second point is these experiences are typically overdetermined. What it actually means is that there are lots of different mechanisms involved, and any one of these mechanisms could result in that particular experience, but by just looking at the experience, we have typically no clue what actually caused that experience, which creates problems for us if we want to scientifically explain that. Then I will talk about 3 major variants of multi-indicator models that we typically use in order to validate whatever our respondents say or tell us. And I will quickly, hopefully, explain what the invariance paradigm is all about to, like demystify it in some way. And then I will reflect quickly about some of these qualitative methods for single indicator approaches and thinking about validity and invariance more broadly. The interesting and challenging part for me is that, like we started off with non-ordinary, but actually the more interesting part for me these days is actually the ordinary experiences. Like we being alive, we constantly have a sense of information coming in, which I think I disagree with Anne. Most of the time we're actually not aware of all the information streaming in. And just at some stage something clicks and we take like conscious notice of whatever is happening around us. And then even further down the track, we may actually remember that experience a day later, a year later, 10 years later. And like one of the challenging questions for me is actually, what makes an experience stand out and why is something becoming memorable? Why do we take notice of some things? Because like constantly there's this stream of information from the outside, from our body. Yet what we actually remember, if you will ask me like in a year's time, I probably will remember nothing of this event except maybe like I had a good joke with Ottavio, we had a good lunch or whatever. Like most of the information is gone. Right? So what's going on here? So a very kind of comic book attempt here, right? We have sensory internal, external input. Then we have these neurochemical processes that Ottavio quickly talked about. And then an immediate, like something that we know from cultural psychology, looking at visual illusions, is that actually these chemical processes, even at the level of the retina, are influenced by all sorts of environmental influences. So a classic one is UV light. Depending on your exposure to UV light, you have different susceptibility to visual illusions compared to others. Right? So a visual illusion will look differently if you're at sea level versus, like on a high mountain. Toxins, nutrients, psychoactive substances change how these signals being processed, physical stressors, etc., etc. So now these processes are going on. They're being related. Probably Georgie will talk about that on Saturday a bit more. Then all of this information needs to be integrated, integrated across multiple brain networks. We're still not even talking about consciousness, nothing. There's a lot of stuff going on all the time in our brains, in our body, chemicals going here, chemicals going there, and only at some specific point, we don't actually understand really when that is happening, we will become aware of that. And that's one of the big questions. It's like, at what moment do we actually become aware of what's going on in our body or around us? And then we create meaning around this. And the interesting part of it is all of the stuff that's happening beforehand is conditioned on what we make of it, right? So it's one of these mysteries, actually, that most of the time what we actually live in is a hallucination. It's our prediction of what we expect to see, hear, feel, etc., and we only update that. We only update this neurochemical signal processing and the integration if there's some kind of prediction error going on somewhere, right? So, boy, how do we actually get at that? Right? It raises really interesting questions. And to make it even worse, you know, like about 50 years of cognitive research have shown that our memories are anything but real, you know, traces of what has happened. Every time you remember something, you change what is in your brain. You know, so there's a whole literature on reconditioning of memories. So every time you remember something, something of that moment when you remembered will be saved, and that will become part of your memory. So basically, if you ask somebody to complete a survey, you're already changing that person's memory. Right? And one of the big questions is, you know, like, to what extent is our questioning already interfering with what is going on? Right? And so now you may wonder, you know, like, I'm basically a cultural psychologist. Where the heck is culture here? It was like neurobiology, biology, cognitive, stuff like that. You know, does culture play a role? My tentative attempt here is the social, cultural, historical context is probably something that is, you know, like, I'm very much interested in cultural evolution, evolutionary approaches to culture. So I think is strongly influenced by the ecological conditions in which any group of humans is living, where we try and, you know, like, adapt to the environment. And then that influences our awareness and meaning creation of whatever experiences we have in that context, which then feeds back into that system. So basically culture comes in, you know, like, relatively late in the process, but then through all these feedback loops, it has an influence on what is going on at the you know, like, at the brain level, and also at the neurochemical signal processing level. So I have talked about some of those things a few years ago in a book where I mainly talked about, like, how can we actually look at experiences, you know, the memory recall part, and make inferences about these other things. And it's really, really tricky to actually do that. And my personal view is, as psychologists, we're basically walking in the dark, right? So, you know, like, I'm really excited with Ottavio because, you know, like, that bridge is just gigantic. You know, like, with Thiago, we had an idea a few years ago, how can we potentially look at all these biological neural networks that we know are pretty well described and link them to whatever we do with a survey. We gave up on that, right? Because, you know, the bridge is just so big. You know, like, it's a real challenge. So I already talked about predictive coding implicitly, which is really, really, you know, it's an interesting framework. I use it as a framework. I'm not using predictive coding in the true sense of mathematical models, although they are actually probably really well described if we think about, for example, voice hearing. I will talk about voice hearing just in a second. It's probably one of the best non-ordinary experiences to use a predictive coding framework because it was developed on auditory and also visual stimuli. And the other thing that I already alluded to is basically our plasticity of memory, that our memory is not fixed and is constantly updated, and that's why we have all this recovery of memories, loss of memory, and so on and so on. So now quickly where I want to go with just something that I find personally interesting, because in our sample about 60 to 70% nationally representative samples here in Brazil have the experience of hearing voices. So now this is way above the psychiatric literature. What is going on? Should we, you know, like, Alexander, you have a lot of work to do here. Right, so what is going on here, right? And so, you know, like, I started looking, you know, I'm not somebody who's studying voices, but I find it very interesting. I started looking into this. And boy, the voice literature is diverse. Like here's basically all, like dimensions that have been discussed in the hearing voices literature. And one of the key things in this literature is these experiences are most likely diverse and highly variable from participant to participants and also across time, right? So it is a super complex phenomenon, right? How do we start capturing that, like scientifically? And then the next slide, I really want to, just freak you out. I took a recent review on voice hearing and Nature reviews and took all the different models and tried to put them onto my little scheme that I just cooked up for this presentation to see like all the different theories, and that's not even all of them, but the most significant theories of how they would actually, like could be placed in this little schema that the comic book schema that I put here, right? So we have all these different theories that tend to explain some parts of voice hearing. It's incredible, like, and the issue is that if we ask individuals about, have you heard voices, we have a multitude of potential mechanisms that may have led to that, and a multitude of potential experiences that constitute what it means to hear voices, right? So, by the way, like, you won't get any answers. I'm just making your life more difficult, right? So that's my point here right now. But I find it, like as a scientist, it's good. It's good to have challenges, right? Ottavio, like with your big molecule stuff, I'm looking at that and going like, what the heck? Anyway, so one of the challenges that I, as a psychologist, that I deal with is once we have some kind of questions and we get answers in either an interview or in a survey, is how can we actually know that people understood it in the way that we wanted? And like how can we actually get valid responses from participants? So most of the time, like a common framework, which is about 100 years old, is classical test theory. So the idea is you reframe your questions in multiple ways. So you want to ask one question, but you're not sure whether people understand that question. So you rephrase it 3-4 times, and then you look at the consistency between the responses to see whether people actually really got what you wanted. So now, simple, right? But now you get the statisticians involved and the methodologists, and they go like, well, actually, you could look at these answers in 3 different ways. There are actually more ways, but at least 3 different ways. So there's something that is like an unknown variable that causes the responses to all 4 or 3 or whatever number of items. We could also say, like, because you happened to answer any of these items in the same way, something magically emerges, a formative model, or like maybe there are just 4 different answers that happen to occur together, right? A network model. Just to give you, like to break that down a little bit. Here are some items from voice hearing inventories. Actually, there are multiple dimensions of voice hearing, and I actually realized I'm actually an active voice hearer according to some of these dimensions, which got me really scared, especially after I realized that my condition of, like if I prepare for a talk or if I have, prepare for any kind of conversation, I play out conversations in my head. And I actually hear the voices of the people that I imagine, which apparently is a common thing, apparently makes me presupposed for all sorts of clinical problems. So if I break down here in a second, like, Alexander, don't judge me. But so basically, one item is like I hear voices speaking my thoughts aloud. So that's you actually hearing your own thoughts. Then one that is actually relatively similar to the inventory question. I have had the experience of hearing a person's voice and found that no one was there. then you have all these items going into specific dimensions. So is the voice actually known to you? Are voices informative? And then the one that I was just talking about, when I'm talking to myself about things in my mind, it's like I'm having a conversation with myself. In my case, I actually hear the voices of individuals talking to me. And one of the interesting theories about how pathological voice experiences happen is under situations of stress, for example, I could just start to not realize anymore that it is in my head, me actively voicing these thoughts, but then I'm experiencing them as coming from the outside. So now, if we have all these questions here, the classic psychology approach would be, let's factor analyze it, and then we assume there's some kind of latent thing going on somewhere in our brain that we already know doesn't exist. But basically, based on the consistency of the responding, we would assume that there's some underlying factor that explains the consistency of the responding. Right? Importantly, like the thing that people don't realize, factor analysis, you can prove anything. That's the whole point of factor analysis. You can prove anything you want. What needs to happen is you have to have this idea of what is happening at the latent level. And this is most of the time one of the challenges, that people have no idea and they treat it as if it was this boy here, which is actually a latent variable as a formative emergent combinatorial logic model where you just observe. This is your classic principal component analysis, right? So have you heard of principal component analysis? Some people, maybe, yes? Yeah, kind of. Yeah. Well, like it's one of the inventions that psychologists gave to science. And now the rest of science uses it, and psychologists now go like, this is evil, because there's no theory, right? So basically what happens is you look at the consistency in responses, and you just assume by having this consistency, something is there, which is actually a really cool way of just thinking about your data. There's some kind of consistency in your data, and the problem now that psychologists are doing is they assume something meaningful is happening. But most of the time, actually, it can be random. Like as in the example that Elliot put forward there. There are actually more interesting variations of that example, which are being discussed at the moment. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into that. There's a lot of stuff going on right now with a couple of people who favor this one and then make causal claims about the data. This is a side comment. There's a really big discussion going on right now in psychology and in sociology and political science about what kind of methods we can use to make claims about our data. And like I'm on one side that basically defends the use of these methods with certain constraints. And there are other groups that actually say we should move away from all these methods and just anything goes. So it will be interesting to see, like in 10 years' time, how this discussion plays out. But now the third option that I just quickly want to talk about, and I think is quite exciting, is networks. Because networks, you don't make any assumptions about what is actually driving whatever you observe, and you look at the associations by themselves. And then, for example, in some of the network models that have been done with voice hearing, they have identified this conversation with myself component as being very crucial in a clinical network. So basically, if people have this conversation with themselves in their mind, and then external triggers, which you can put into a network, come in, you can understand when and under what conditions people potentially start developing pathological voice experiences, right? So the interesting point now is that using the inventory, we can understand a lot of people potentially have predispositions. And I think the great potential with this is if we can help people become aware of these predispositions, we can help them prepare for it, we can give them the resources through self-help groups in various formats. It can be a religious, spiritual self-help group. It can be a secular self-help group. And we can help them deal with these voices that they have on a very regular basis to get better or to move on in their lives. And if something bad happens, they have the resources. You know, like what we were talking about earlier about these early versus late experiences in life, right? So if you have the framework to make sense of these experiences, you have a buffer. If you don't have them, then you might be in trouble, right? So what I'm talking about here is actually statistical models. But once you start thinking about what they allow you to do in a real world context, I think it becomes more interesting. And that's actually where I'm getting most excited about in terms of these statistical models. But back to our main question. How can we now compare subjective experiences? So typically the way it is done is you get basically, let's say, people in the US, people in Brazil, you give them a couple of questions, and then you try and see, do these questions relate to each other in similar ways? And here's a paper we published a few years ago where we gave people different options of doing that in R, which is a free online tool where you can basically play through all these different mechanisms. And I quickly want to walk you through it. The idea is that you have to have some kind of latent score, which most of the time is the sum of all these experiences together. And then you look at the relationship with any single one of these experiences, right? And so the lowest level of comparability that we could have is what is called configural invariance. So basically, do you have an idea if we would plot two lines for two groups there, what would be the relationship between our sum score, so basically the presumed latent variable, and the observed score? What do we expect? Yeah? What do you think? Should be some kind of what? Positive relationship? Yeah? So basically, if people have a higher score overall, right, we would also expect them to respond more positively to this particular item, right? So if we have two groups, let's say US, let's say Brazil, we would expect independent, or basically in general, as people report more of these experiences, they should also report more positively to any single one of them, right? But the relative relationship may change, right? So we don't make any presumptions about the strength of the relationship, right? So, and this is basically where now statisticians would go happy and go crazy and say like, well, there are all sorts of uniform and non-uniform item biases here, so you can't actually do anything with the data. And they're correct. If you have this kind of situation, all you can say is voice hearing does exist in Brazil and it does exist in the US, and that's it. You can't make any more comparisons, any more claims about your data. Right? It's pretty sad, isn't it? Right? Because this is actually where most of our psychological data is, unfortunately. So we have a whole literature that is full of stuff that we can't actually trust in any way. But that's life. The next best solution is what is called metric invariance. So the idea here is, in two groups, as people have a higher score, a higher ability, they're also more likely to respond positively to any particular item, right? And the relationship between the overall score and the specific observation, the specific item, is more or less the same. So basically, I can start ranking people in both groups, right? So if you have higher score in the US, you're more likely to answer this item positively. If you have a higher score in Brazil, you're also more likely to answer that item positively. So we have kind of preservation of ranks. Hooray! We can start doing stuff with this. We can look at correlations, we can look at networks, we can do all sorts of things, but we can't actually compare the relative levels. Because what is happening is we still have this mystery kind of unmeasured third variable, unaccounted variance. Like basically there's a difference between the two groups that is not explained by our latent variable here, right? And I make no assumptions about what the latent variable is. It could be anything. So we can only truly compare data if we reach this level where the lines are pretty much on top of each other, where basically whatever is left in our data is insignificant and we can make claims about, well, actually group A and group B are comparable. How often does that happen in the literature? It depends on the literature that you look at. Most people are actually scared to test for this. So about 3 to 4% of the studies actually test for this level of comparability. Of the 3 to 4% that do test it, it depends on the paper that you, or the area that you look at. In management, it's actually pretty good. In some areas of experimental psychology, which is the beacon of, like hard science, 0. So basically, don't trust cognitive experiments. There's a really nice paper that came out last year where they looked at all sorts of studies and found that most studies published in psychology do not meet this criterion. So we cannot actually compare data at all. It's pretty sad, isn't it? My view on this is actually more positive, and I hope to come. How many more hours do I have?
About 15 minutes.
500 minutes?
No, 15.
15. As 150. I have a logarithmic problem in my mind at the moment. The point that I want to make here is actually this opens possibilities for inquiry, because that basically means there's a lot of stuff that we don't understand. Like our theories need to be refined. So, coming back to this mature science part, we are very much at an immature science part. We don't know what is going on with a lot of the stuff that we're studying, right? So, like there's a special issue that I'm editing. I will show you the link right at the end. So I invite you to submit stuff to that special issue, trying to reflect actually on these issues, on what's actually going on. What can we learn from that observation? So statistical invariance approach is great. They're best described for this kind of reflective variable model. They vary in complexity. So some of the approaches are very simple. What I showed you here is a conditional ANOVA example, which is really easy and simple to understand. We could do it way more complex. It can be applied to pretty much any data that you have. The cool stuff is, these days, the statistics is moving so fast that we start, for example, one of the big questions is human voice talking about human voices again. Human voice experiences are very diverse. We already know that some, like subclinical groups, for example, people with autism, typically don't hear voices, right? So whenever we basically give our voice inventories to individuals who are high on an autism level spectrum, and it's actually a sizable part of the population, they will not be able to understand the questions because they don't have, most likely there are some alterations in the brain networks that do not allow them to have these kind of experiences. The cool thing is there's statistical approaches now that can allow you to model these things. So we can look at person parameters in these models and see which items do work for what kind of population. The fun part is it's possible. The terrible part is it's possible but terrible. A lot of computations. The exciting part here is the network models, which I think are really exciting. The issue is there's no clear standards yet for how to deal with these comparability standards for network models, but it's rapidly evolving. So pretty much every month there's some new development, so it's amazing. The challenges with this stuff is you need large samples. The focus is really at the population level or subpopulations. You can apply this with individuals if you have repeated measures, so that's possible. So that's, for example, in experimental work where you can do this, and you need multiple indicators. You can rephrase items, you can focus on specific aspects or elements of the experiences. The issues are, there are lots of discussions in the literature, and I think this is the main problem, that the literature on invariance is so technical that most people basically zone out, like half of you here right now, because it's very technical, very statistical, and people don't step back and think about what it actually means. There's also a lot of discussion and uncertainty about how to deal with non-invariant items. So if you identify an item that seems to work a little bit differently, what do you do with it now? It carries information, but how do you deal with that information in your model? And I already mentioned that scalar invariance is difficult to obtain. So now, moving back to what we have heard already with the response process evaluation, which I think is exciting. It's basically repeating what we have heard on a number of occasions already, because it's a special case of cognitive testing. So cognitive testing is used widely in the educational literature, so TIMSS, PISA, those kind of policy-relevant studies do that a lot. It's used a lot in, for example, the European Social Survey, which is, again, very policy-relevant, because there people want to make sure that people understand the questions. The issue is a lot of the documentation is not widely available. As you can imagine, it's policy-relevant, et cetera, but it's a type of method that has been around for about 100 years, is being used, but not as widely used as we really would hope. So with the RPE, we have seen already, so basically you ask people to report on the individual experiences, describe what experience they had, or what the experience might be like if they haven't had it. Then you calculate some validation score. One adaptation that we did in our Brazilian team, we always used 4 trained coders, and then we came up with some heuristics to kind of make it more objective in some way. So if 3 of the 4 coders agreed with each other about whether the experience described is valid or not, then the majority won. If there was a 50-50 situation in terms of the classification, basically it implies we need more information. And then if we had some kind of mix between those, then we had an adjudicator. So that was often me or some other team member, or we also played around with ChatGPT, and we have some very interesting experiences with the definitions. Humans understand definitions differently than large language models, which is a whole other talk. But the validation scores do actually work reasonably well. The major difference that Elliot and Everton already talked about, it's a kind of a cycle. You go back and forth, right? So you test, you tweak, you test again, you tweak till you reach your validation score of 0.8. But here come some challenges. And there is no free lunch nowhere, anywhere in psychology or in methods. And this is inspired by some of the stuff that I was exposed to recently at a conference in Europe, where people go back to basically questions about person experience, person-to-person experience versus population experience. There are a lot of implicit assumptions built into this. So we ask a lot of individuals to make inferences about a sample that we don't know exactly what it is, about a population that we vaguely are aware of. So this approach assumes that the individuals are representative of the population, the individuals are interchangeable, which is also an assumption in all the surveys that we typically have, and individual differences are irrelevant. So if we think about voice hearing, we already know individual differences are not irrelevant because they're clinical conditions that are actually relatively common that make these experiences differently, or that imply different interpretations of these items. So there are assumptions built into this that we have to live with, right? But we have to be aware of the implications of that. So we have to ask questions about heterogeneity of the populations. One thing that is really interesting and links with Everton, with Alexander, and a couple of the other ones, actually markers, like thinking about, for example, dissociation. Markers can be highly group specific. And that was one of the things that in our review that we found. Encostar, incorporar, mean different things in different groups. Yet, they kind of imply the same thing. But unless you have the language, you don't know what's going on. Previously, I was doing work in Thailand, and there people were mounted by spirits. If you phrase it in a different way, people don't understand. The problem now is we have specific subgroups. So if you tweak it for a specific subgroup, the other group will not understand, right? So you're like, how do we deal with this complexity, right? And this is really going back to this idiographic versus nomothetic discussion. Are we trying to make inferences about the individual, that the individual understood it, or do we try and compare like groups of individuals, so comparing persons with each other, or subgroups, or do we try and make some claims about the population? And this is an issue that, it's coming back. So that's Winkelband, 1894, and right now there was a small group expert meeting in Europe where people went back and said, like, hold on, we do all this stuff about psychology, cognitive science, but what does it actually mean? Are we talking about individuals? Are we talking about a person versus another person? Or do we talk about samples, right? So it's actually really interesting statistical and phenomenological questions, right? And one last bit that I think is actually also interesting applies to the sampling of surveys and the sampling of participants in for example, these qualitative surveys. We make decisions often based on small samples with qualitative research, right? So Elliot gave really good examples about, you look at the responses, small samples, batches, 5 to 10 individuals. You look, is there some kind of imprecision, like poorly worded responses? Does that imply something about the way I phrase the questions, right? And like people have different verbal skills, different motivations to participate, and so on and so on. So, like one thing that started to bug us a lot, should we actually tweak an item, or should we collect more responses first to see like how recurrent is actually this misunderstanding? And here's just one example. This is an item, love, which was featured as well early on, which passed the test brilliantly, right? So it was highly robust on average in a sample of 53 participants. It passed the threshold. But now, if you randomly select 5 individuals, when you do that repeatedly, or you randomly select 10 individuals and you do that repeatedly, in about 35% of the cases with 5 individuals, you may make a decision of start tweaking the item, and that might have been premature, right? Because you just randomly happen to encounter some of those individuals that did not understand or did not provide a good explanation. So it's a challenge, right? And so bringing all of this back to the bigger question about invariance is the comparability. How do we know that people understand our questions, right? And stepping now one step back even further, does the researcher know what they want? And I think that's often even the more challenging question, right? Does the researcher know? And I've been in this business. Part of like how I got through my PhD is developing items for companies about all sorts of stuff. So basically, I was an item writer that would then validate items using various methods, and I would get very nicely paid for that. It's good. But basically, I've seen basically how test companies work. do they have a clear idea of what they want to measure? I'm not sure, right? And so the big issue for, I'm not sure if you can see this, we just, with a colleague, we jumped into this debate, which I briefly mentioned earlier about, invariance testing, yes or no. We jumped into that debate, and we just got a paper accepted there, which hopefully should be out very soon. And in that paper, we make an argument which we also elaborate further in this other preprint, which is not yet published, that basically argues we have to think about the function. What do we want to measure? And this is actually the point that was missing from that factor analysis part, right? So Gaga-wise, what is that, right? So, and we have to have a clear idea of what we want to measure, think about how we can present that to individuals, how we can present the data. Everton mentioned that briefly, right? Basically, the response process, when people respond to your surveys, they have all sorts of stuff going on in their minds, right? So if you, like the questions about voice hearing, if you first give them a couple of questions about clinical pathology, which we tried, people are reluctant to admit that they hear voices. If you present the items by itself, people are much more willing to actually say, yes, I have had that experience, right? So, the actual response moment matters because there's all sorts of other stuff going on, right? And then basically what we typically, most of the time as psychologists focus on, which is our statistical smoke screen, may not give us the full picture. And we have to basically consider the whole research process, starting with our ideas in our minds of what we actually want to study, right? So that's why I think I completely agree we are immature, but I think on the other hand, we have to take theory more seriously. What is it actually, what do we want to test comparatively between different religious groups, between clinical, non-clinical groups, between the US, Brazil, and so on. And so I invite you to submit work. I'm really interested. Let's challenge the paradigm. Submit stuff there to challenge this paradigm of how we do research most of the time. And my final pleading that I want to finish off with, validity is important. The problem is most of the time we do it in a somewhat obscure way that has nothing to do with actually our objective. And I think one important point is we have to align it more with our objective, so our theory, our intentions, right? I really think both quantitative and qualitative models have strengths and weaknesses and they're complementary, right? So that's why I really believe we need to do quantitative stuff, we need to do qualitative stuff, and we should not prioritize one over the other. The advantages, the statistical models, they are there. They're really good. They're advancing at the neck-breaking speed. The challenge is they're complex. So, for example, some of these like where you can put the person into the model, when I try and run it on my laptop, it can take a week. Just to give you an idea of the complexity. I also think any single indicator model can be reformulated into a multi-indicator model, which I think is an interesting idea to actually, play around with the idea. So if we have an idea, for example, with the RPE, something works, let's rephrase these questions a little bit and test whether people would actually answer them in the same way. Because that can give us additional information, especially if we look at larger samples, person moderator variables, and so on and so on. And so that's pretty much it. And I hope you're still awake now for a really, really amazing poster presentation. Really challenge our poster presenters. Enjoy the happy hour. And thank you.